Parent Session, supporting your children to success and also understanding children with learning difficulties. I'm jtebbutt and I'm from Raising Achievement. I started out as an undiagnosed person with ADHD, and it really coloured my educational experience. And it wasn't until I was 40 that I learned that I had inattentive type ADHD and the impact that that had had on my education. We also went on to have children later when I was married, and I found out that our son had both dyslexia and ADHD. By that stage, I was a teacher, and I realised quite quickly that the needs of children with learning difficulties aren't catered for at school. And I guess I had two choices. One was to sort of complain and try and get something done. And the other was to maybe become a specialist, get stuck in and try and do something about it. And I chose the latter. And it was a very interesting journey for me. Our son ended up, he was actually, I noticed really early on that he had difficulties and differences. Basically, from the time he was able to walk, he often would go wandering and get lost. And I can remember waking up one morning at 7 o'clock and he was gone. And I panicked. We were on a farm, we had rivers, troughs, all those sorts of things. And just sort of getting to the point of not knowing what to do next, I saw two figures wandering in the distance. Now, our young boy had actually got up, got on his two-wheeler bike with trainer wheels and cycled down to the cowshed to see his dad. Just so scary. We would also find him on the apex of roofs. He loved to survey the world from great heights. So it was pretty easy to see that he was a different sort of child, you know, and one of those who liked to climb. He went off to school, kindergarten, and within a few weeks, the kindergarten teacher was saying to me, Jenny, your son's going to need a good wife. And I thought, what does that mean? And basically what it meant was that he went round from activity to activity and left a trail of destruction behind him. And somebody had to go round and tidy up after him. Now, he had a couple of saving graces. He actually had personality plus, and he was one of those cute kids that everybody loved. And he also had a sense of humour, and that actually came out as a toddler as well. So he actually got away with a lot. But by the time he went to school, he was an October baby, and by Christmas, the very experienced class teacher was saying to me, Jenny, he's just not making his milestones. And I remember saying to her, look, no matter, I'm a good primary trained teacher. At the time, I prided myself in my ability to teach reading, and I used to write on my CVs that was a strength. And I remember saying to her, look, I'll just get stuck in over the holidays. I'll do some work with him, and I'm sure it will be fine. And I did all that and into term one, and it wasn't fine. And I realised then that he had some kind of learning difficulty. Now, it wasn't long before somebody said to me, have you heard of SPELLed? Now, I hadn't heard of SPELLed, but what they said that they would do was assess your child, determine if they had a learning difficulty, and if they did, a specialist program would be developed. And that sounded like a good idea to me. We were trained as teachers to have a sort of comprehensive assessment, like a pre-test, do a quality intervention and a post-test. And so that was the path we took. He was actually diagnosed with dyslexia very quickly, and some people had already started throwing around the idea of ADHD. Now, I didn't know about my ADHD at that stage, and I have to say I didn't really like the idea of it. I didn't want to medicate, and I thought that if we have a good structured program, a good homeschool partnership, and we address all his learning needs, that everything would be fine. And I have to say, sadly, I was wrong. I now actually recognise that when we have children who've got learning difficulties, we actually have to look at the diagnosis part. We have to look at social, emotional, behavioural, as well as educational. And I call that a multimodal approach. And when we take a multimodal approach, things actually work fine. But I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit. I really just wanted to give you a background of where I come from and why I'm so passionate about supporting parents. Now, when I was going through this journey, there wasn't much information. There weren't coordinators, there weren't specialists, and the organisations were few and far between. And we got our boy diagnosed, and as I said, he was diagnosed with dyslexia very quickly, and we chose to ignore the ADHD. We were actually forced to look into that further in his teenage years, often with ADHD. Often with ADHD, it can exacerbate in teenage years. So I just became so passionate about this area of education. And I often say I'm really just a mum who wanted to support their child through school and develop programs and resources to support him. And I realised very quickly that as he went through the school, that things weren't in place for him. Now, the other thing that was really quite interesting is I ended up becoming involved with SPEL, both locally and nationally. I was on the national executive for SPEL New Zealand for a few years, and I also worked with ADHD. I got a specialist qualification in teaching literacy, and I also, that was through Massey University, and I also did the SPELD teacher training and became a trainer for them for a number of years. And interestingly, I would say that it took me 15 years before I felt I could call myself an educational consultant. And I think that's a real surprise to some people. Now, if you're watching this video today, you now know quite a bit about me and my background. But if you're watching it just to support your child through school and help them with home learning, that will be perfect. But if you do have a child with learning differences and difficulties, you will also understand a lot more about that. So it's great to have you here, and I'm sure you're going to get a lot of information from the session. So I'm going to do a screen share now, and if you would actually like this PowerPoint sent to you, I'm very happy for you to send me an email and we can get that PowerPoint sent out for you. So one of the interesting things I found about education was I felt that we actually cater for some groups really well. And most children we talk about are mainstream students. And we do a lot of good things in education. We've got great teachers, we've got good specialists, we've got some good literacy programs, numeracy programs. We've got support, additional support with teacher aides and so on that we put in schools. And the majority of our children actually are this, I call them second wave, but they're this mainstream group. We have a few of our learners who we call gifted and talented. And those students find learning really easy. And our job as teachers is just to put learning opportunities and experiences in front of them, and they almost seem to learn without, they catch the first wave, which is why I call them first wave learners. And there's a few children in each class in that category. I'm going to miss third wave learners for a moment, and I'm going to go to our fourth wave learners. Fourth wave learners come under the umbrella of special education. They often are children with major sensory type difficulties like vision and hearing problems, children with intellectual difficulties, children with physical difficulties and need support around the school for that. And also sometimes we have our behaviour students in there, but these children tend to be funded by special education, and it only caters for at the most 3% of our population. And you will often hear people say, my child didn't qualify for special education. And that's why, because you have to be in the bottom 3% or meet those criteria before you can get that funding. Now, I missed out third wave learners, and our third wave learners are children who have things like dyslexia, dyspraxia. They may be on the autistic spectrum. They may have ADHD. And I count ADHD in there, not because it's considered a learning difficulty, but often children with ADHD have a learning difficulty to go with it. And also some of the remediation that you want to put in for ADHD is actually similar to the others. And we also have children with auditory and visual processing difficulties. Now, we actually now know through research that our student numbers that are third wave actually make up 22% of the population. Now, yes, that's a minority, but it's not a small one. And I think that the challenge that we've had in education is that we train our teachers for mainstream education. Some people have got special education qualifications and training, but we haven't trained our teachers for the area of third wave education. So we often hear people talking about children who slip through the cracks, excuse me, and the children who slip through the cracks are the third wave learners with those learning differences. So if you think about when you were going to school, you can probably look back to your classes and think of students who were in each of the waves. You can probably put yourself in a wave. I now affiliate with being a third wave learner because I had ADHD. But interestingly enough, you can be first wave and third wave at the same time. We have many of our children on the spectrum, children with ADHD, and others who can be gifted with learning difficulties. And so often those children are underperforming. And we know that 10 to 15% of our children will be gifted and have a learning difficulty. So it's when you're thinking about your children and where they fit, they may fit into more than one category. The other area that we often get children of third and fourth wave learners. So they may have physical difficulties, or they may have a sensory difficulty, but also have something like ADHD or dyslexia. And so I find it's really important if we support those learners as third and fourth wave at the same time to get the best outcomes. Now, some children have barriers to learning, and those barriers, actually, I will say everybody has barriers to learning. Things like we might have moved around a lot. That happened to us when we were children for my parents' work. So we changed schools quite a bit. That was a challenge. We may have children with English second language, for example, and that can be a barrier to learning. And so if you're in the second wave, you might be even 6 months to 18 months achieving below your chronological age, but we do some great things in school, and it's pretty easy to support those children to get them close to age or at age. And also some of those mainstream students, maybe even your good B students, who do a bit above average. So it's interesting for you to be able to think about, where did I fit as a learner and where do my children fit as learners? And then we can look at how we support them based on the wave of learner that they are. Now, it's really interesting because teachers often say to me then, well, what's the difference between a child who has barriers to learning and someone who has learning difficulties? Now, we actually know that there are underpinning cognitive weaknesses. And for children with learning difficulties, these underpinning cognitive weaknesses prevent them from being able to access the system. And these are things like auditory processing. They actually don't take in auditory information well. There's about 6 different auditory difficulties they might have. They might have auditory discrimination problems where they can't hear the difference between letter sounds. They may have trouble with auditory memory, where they don't remember things that they've heard well. They may have difficulty with auditory sequencing. And you'll often hear children say words like hospital, aminal, emily, instead of hospital, animal, and enemy. They get the order of the syllables wrong, and that's an auditory processing difficulty. Sometimes children have auditory figure ground, which is an unusual word, but what it means is that they can't decipher the important information from the background of the information. So, and being able to see the whole picture and sort of hear and understand new concepts. So there's quite a few auditory problems that children can have. And in the same way, we can have visual processing problems where they don't remember well what they've seen. They have trouble deciphering the difference between letters B, D, P, Q, M and W are often inverted. N and U are often confused as well. And also they can get the sequence of letters wrong. How often have you been doing home spelling with your children and the word might be help and they spell it H-E-P-L instead of H-E-L-P? And so that's another example of visual sequencing. So visual processing is an underpinning weakness. And we actually know that 70% of children with learning difficulties have some kind of vision problem. So vision or visual. So it's important that we address those. And there are optometrists who are known as behavioural optometrists who look at vision and learning. And when I have got a student who's got a learning difficulty and I suspect a vision problem, I will always refer to a behavioural optometrist rather than a normal optometrist. Normal optometrists look at functional vision. They look at things like short-sightedness, long-sightedness. They also look at eye health. But a behavioural optometrist also focuses on vision and learning problems and other difficulties that impact students' learning. So it's important to go to the right specialist. Other underpinning weaknesses include gross motor skills and fine motor skills. And often, people say, well, why do we have to worry about motor skills? For example, we don't all have to be good sports players. Now, that's true. We don't all have to be good sports players. But what we now know is that children who have poor left-right brain integration have poor coordination, and those students are also at risk for learning difficulties. So we are interested in the gross and fine motor skills. Phonological awareness is a big one, and you may have heard a bit about this on the news recently. Schools have been talking about structured literacy, and they have been talking about the reading methods that we have been using over recent years haven't supported our learners well. And that is because many children have this phonological weakness and they have poor letter sound knowledge. So we have to teach using letter sounds and phonological awareness. And it's really interesting because when I do screening assessments with children, 99% of children have a phonological weakness. So it's fantastic that schools are now implementing structured literacy that use phonemic and phonological awareness. And interestingly, the international research is actually showing that up to 40% of our learners haven't done well with our traditional whole language and balanced reading approach. So to address the needs of this 40%, it's very important that we all move to a structured literacy approach. The other one that's interesting is short-term and working memory. And the short-term and working memory means that children can't hold information in their head and then use it or even manipulate. And you'll often find working memory problems in maths. They can't hold the numbers in their head. Sometimes they can't remember and follow instructions. And actually, I was even out for coffee with someone yesterday, and the person was frustrated because the person hadn't remembered their order. And I actually said lots of our kids, it was a young teenager, lots of our children have the short-term and working memory problem, and it impacts you in a lot of different areas. So the short-term and working memory is important to develop, and also processing speed. Many of our children take longer to do things than others, and as parents, we will often notice it with homework. You might have a 10 or 20-minute homework task that takes our children an hour. And that is because they have processing delays that impact their learning. And they often get things on their reports, notes on their reports, or their IEPs, the individual education plans, about work completion and actually having to complete more work. And that is because they've got processing delays, and we actually need to address the short-term and working memory and the processing delays if we're going to improve things like work output and completing work more quickly. So those are the 6 underpinning weaknesses. Now, also, many children with learning difficulties and have difficulty with organisation. They have trouble organising themselves. Often our children also forget their homework books, their reading books, their swimming togs, the note that they were supposed to bring home from school. And that's partly to do with the short-term and working memory, but it's also to do with organisation. And I often say we've got some really clever kids, but they can't organise their own brilliance. And our children rely on their parents, their teachers, and their teacher aides to put in the organisation and structure for them. And if they're not there to do that, they can't do it for themselves. And how often, like, do your children go off to school and there's actually a reliever for the day? Maybe their teacher's away on a course, or they're sick, or their teacher aide's away, and your child has difficulties at school that day. And that is because they have organisational problems. Things change. They don't have the routines that they normally expect. They're with people that don't necessarily understand them in the same way, so they can go on to have a bad day. So organisation is another thing that we need to address. So I think possibly by now you may even, be thinking about your own children as we went through this, and think about which of these underpinning weaknesses have you noticed with your children. And our children need special ways of teaching. And I often talk to students about how their experiences at school so far, and often I'm speaking with children because they are underachieving. And I end up apologising because basically, unless we understand children with learning difficulties and differences, we understand their underpinning weaknesses, and then we teach them appropriately, they're not going to do well. And that's not fair. And this is actually one of the things about, I do a lot of work with schools around supporting teachers to understand children with learning difficulties and put in accommodations for them, and also different teaching strategies. And it's really important that we all understand that and know this, and then we can apply this for our third and fourth wave learners in the class. Now, the other thing that's really interesting is the research is actually showing that if we teach for third and fourth wave, or teach for third wave, everybody will benefit. Whereas I would go so far as to say that schools have set ourselves up for mainstream learners, and if you're a mainstream learner, you tend to do well, but if you're a third wave, you don't. So if we can start teaching to third wave, all the learning waves will do well, and we need to move away from this one-size-fits-all approach, and I'm sure that you can identify with that. So one of the things that we often do is specialist assessment. Now, I also do screening assessments because I think it's a lot of money to have a specialist assessment done. And I think it's worthwhile to do a screening assessment first, determine if there are underpinning cognitive weaknesses or there are barriers to learning, and consider the next steps. But a specialist assessment may be required. And the great thing about specialist assessments is that it firstly shows a student's strengths and a student's weaknesses. And when you show strengths and weaknesses, then you can use their strengths to help them become successful, and you can use their weaknesses to lift those to minimize those challenges. And once you've got strengths and weaknesses, then you can design a specific support program. Also, specialist assessments are good for readers and writers for exam time. Often our children get given a reader or a writer or both. Sometimes they can get extra time for their processing delays. Also, they can be given separate accommodation. So for children with ADHD, they can actually have a separate room that they actually work in. And so having a specialist assessment to ensure that our children get optimum results in exams is important. Also, through the assessments, we may want to refer to a behavioural optometrist, which we mentioned before, and also an audiologist. Now, many children can have an auditory weakness, some children have APD, which is an auditory processing disorder. Now, I think it's really important that initially our teaching, when I mentioned that we have to teach differently. It's very important that we address visual and auditory weaknesses through teaching, as well as getting specialist support. So very often, unless I'm really confident that a child has an auditory processing disorder, we will address the auditory weaknesses through teaching. And then if we're still not getting the results that we want to achieve, we may send for an auditory assessment then. But bear in mind that all these things are expensive, so you actually want to do the important things, when you need them. So I mentioned that we actually have to teach our children differently. And so I've come up with 7 key things that are really what I call excellence in teaching. And initially, people talked about auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. We also talked about learning styles. And when they first came out, we actually rushed out to find out whether we were an auditory, visual, or hands-on kind of learner. And interestingly enough, we now know that that's not how it works. How it works is that everybody will learn best when they have an opportunity to learn it through all the senses. Now, schools are renowned for being good auditory places. If you're a good auditory learner, you tend to learn well, and if you don't, you learn less well. Now, with this new research that everybody learns best when they have an opportunity to hear it, see it, and do it, we need to make sure that our learning environments are what we call multisensory. Now, the other thing that is interesting is if you've got a child who's got an auditory weakness and they're predominantly in an auditory learning environment, they're at risk. If you've got a child who's got a visual weakness, and they're in a predominantly visual learning environment, they're at risk. So we need to make sure to get the best outcomes that everybody has all modalities covered. We also know that our children learn best when they have more structure. That's partly to do with the organisation that we talked about. Because they can't organise themselves, they actually need structure. Having routines, having set ways of doing things is just so important for our students. The next one is sequential, and this is actually based on the developmental stages of learning. And so our children learn step by step, and for children with learning difficulties, they've often missed out steps in their learning and have got learning gaps. So it's very important that we know exactly where our children are at, and we move them on step by step. And I think many of the parents actually in lockdown, when they were teaching their children, many of the parents actually started to discover these things. And I had more parents contacting me over the last 3 years than I ever have before. Number one, they've recognised that their children have learning difficulties, and they also felt that they weren't equipped to support them and to deal with them. So a lot of these courses and things that I'm doing now are really designed to support you as parents so that you have that understanding and you can adapt your homework times and home learning as you need to. So sequential is important. Everything should be research-based. We should actually be able to explain our practice. And one point I often make here is in education, we talk a lot about best practice. Now, what's best practice for mainstream students isn't necessarily best practice for third wave students. And I think that's important for us to know, because we often get quoted best practice. And knowing what is good practice for third wave and how that might differ from mainstream can be very helpful. So that's one of the things I also work with schools and teachers around. This one is huge, repetition and overlearning, and this is a really important one for parents. They actually say that if the average child takes 7 times to learn something, then third wave children, it can be exponential up to 49 times, and for fourth wave children, it can be up to 64 times. Now, I'm a teacher, and I'd like to think I'm a good one. I don't believe that any teacher can provide the amount of repetition and overlearning that third and fourth wave learners need in the classroom on their own. And that means that if we've got a child with a learning difficulty, we have to be aware of this and also support the extra learning that's actually needed. Now, what I actually recommend with this is that for schools, we may have specialist teachers, SENCOs, the Special Education Needs Coordinator, or even the resource teacher of learning and behaviour. And there's a new support person in schools now, learning support coordinators. If children are lucky, they may get one session a week with a specialist, usually not more because it's too expensive and we can't afford it. And I say that if teachers can do the 7 times best practice, now if we train our teacher aides to be very good with third wave programs, we can get teacher aides to work with identified students 3 times a week. And I also train all parents. And for parents, if you can provide 3 sessions a week, or someone in the family can, and sometimes we also train community volunteers to assist with that. And then also we can use really good software. And the software, you can put the children on those 3 or 4 times a week. Now, between all of those things, we're actually getting, the amount of repetition and overlearning that children need. But unless we set up that kind of system, I actually believe our children haven't had anywhere near the amount of repetition and overlearning that they need. So, finding out about this is really helpful for you. It also should be based on diagnostic evidence, and schools are getting really good at assessing children, finding out where they're at, and the next step is using that information to then raise student achievement. And also this one is interesting. Metacognitive strategies is a big word, but basically what it means is which strategy should I use, when should I use it, why should I use it, and how. And third wave learners don't pick up metacognitive strategies in the same way as our first and second wave learners. So we need to explicitly teach strategies and then give them 49 or 64 times to practice them. Whereas for first and second wave learners, if you teach them a strategy and then they have normal practice in the classroom, they will actually master it. But our students need more. So those are sort of the 7 excellences. And I think as parents, it's really helpful if we're just aware of these, and wherever possible, we make sure that we can implement at home. Having more structure at home, for example, having, set meal times, routines in the mornings, homework times, that sort of thing. Knowing about the sequential steps. And as we talk about helping our child with learning shortly, we'll look at that. Knowing that we're playing a part in the repetition and overlearning, and also supporting with teaching with strategies. So how can parents help? Number one, they can help with organisation. And I think I've had a lot of parents who've torn their hair out with kids not following routines, kids with messy bedrooms, kids who forget things in the morning. And so that organisation is really important. What I actually recommend is making a poster and actually laminating the poster with all the tasks that are to do. I can remember I used to say to my boy, I want you to go and put your shoes on, also brush your teeth, put your shoes on, get your bag and hop in the car. And I'd find him in the car and he hadn't done any of those things. Now, silly me, I gave him 4 instructions at once and he couldn't retain them. And our children will often remember the first thing we say or the last thing we say, hence the reason that I'd find them in the car. So then I changed and I used to just give 2 instructions. But then I would often find him in his room and he would just, he'd done those things and he was in his room, but he still wasn't organised. So I would then say, can you brush your teeth and come back to me? Can you put your shoes on and come back to me? So that he didn't get distracted and end up playing in his room, and we could go from step by step. But what worked even better was to put this morning routine and all the things he needed on a list by the back door, and with a whiteboard marker, and he could go to there and work through the list and tick them off as he'd done them. And then all we had to do before we walked out the door was to check the list and make sure he had everything that he needed. And that way we're teaching them to remember like set a routine and remember it. So any ways that you can do that at home is really helpful. As a teacher, I used to also do that at school for my children with learning difficulties. I would say things like, have you got your reading book? Have you got the note for taking home? So that they could tick them off and make sure that what had to go home went home. And often we do the problems with glasses, kids who wear glasses, and their glasses are either at home or at school. Some parents ended up getting two pairs of glasses, one for home and school, and whilst that was helpful, it was expensive. So having strategies for managing that is really important. Having understanding, and I think even now, understanding the different types of learners, the underpinning weaknesses that they have, we can actually, when they're not being naughty, like often people think of children with learning difficulties as lazy, naughty, unmotivated, and it's not. The underpinning weaknesses impact their ability to remember things, and that often gets them into trouble at home and at school. Parents can also support with reading, and we're going to talk a bit about reading shortly. Having support with writing, support with spelling and word games can be a good activity. And we're going to talk now about how you can make those activities fun and also raise your child's achievement. So let's talk about home reading first. Now, most younger children bring home a home reading book. Now, your school may now be doing structured literacy, and they may be bringing home decodable texts. And decodable texts are based on the letter sound knowledge and letter patterns. Now, if your child is bringing those home, that's perfect, and it will work in very well with the spelling program that we're doing. Now, for some of you, your schools may still be using leveled text, and you can use those, but you can also, there are some decodable texts that you can get online and use them as parents. So that's also an option. Now, most children stop bringing home daily reading books about year 5, certainly by year 6. And at school, their reading changes to be more about comprehension than about reading. Now, one of the challenges is that children with learning difficulties are not at the stage of reading to learn yet. They're still learning to read. And so we should be guided by the student and their level as to when we stop the teaching of reading, not just because they've reached a certain age. So I recommend that, for example, actually, it took our son till he was 13 or 14 to read and write close to his chronological age. So we had to continue a reading program, also even reading at home to him, went on longer than you would normally expect. So we're guided by our children, but we want to get the right approach. So we want to make reading fun, and we want to do little and often. Now, we have always worked with the Brenda Lofthouse Parent Tutors and Reading resource, and it was based on a program which was Pause, Prompt, Praise. Now, we also, what that program focuses on is teaching the 6 effective strategies that good readers use. Now, one of those effective strategies is that they look at the letter sounds and the letter patterns in the word to decode or decipher or read the word. Now, what we say is that you should use letter sound patterns, the phonemic and phonological first, and then use the other strategies to back up, like whether a child can work out the word. And I'll show you what I mean. What are the 6 strategies that good readers use? These are in no particular order, but the first is to go back and try again. Often when children are reading, they'll accept nonsense. They're reading and they know it doesn't make sense, but they don't go back and try again. So we actually say to students, whenever you hear that something doesn't sound right, I want you to go back, try again, have another look, and you'll use those letter sounds and cues. We often talked about it as we want to look at how the word starts, we want to look at the letter patterns, we want to break down the word with the sounds. Or we want to check the picture for a clue. And although we don't want students to over-rely on the pictures may be helpful in interpreting. We want to think about the story and what will make sense. Does that sound right? Will that word actually fit there? The read on and go back strategy is helpful. When sometimes some of the later words give you a clue as to what the earlier words might be. And we also want to go back and check if they've read the little words okay. Often I find children read on for no, do for don't, and that sort of thing, and then they end up with the wrong meaning. So we actually have to slow them down enough so that they can actually get the accuracy. Now, the difference between a good reader and someone who doesn't yet read well is good readers know how to help themselves when they get stuck with reading. They not only know the strategies, they actually use them. And so what we're doing as a home tutor is we're teaching and reinforcing these strategies, so to give them that repetition and overlearning so that they are using the strategies that efficient readers use. And it's been absolutely amazing because I've been involved with this program now for many years. I implemented it initially across 30 schools in the Bay of Plenty. It was actually funded by East Bay REAP. They subsidised the putting in for schools. And we consistently got 18 months to 2 years reading gain for every student that did the program. And in fact, some students actually improved 3 and 4 years, being on the program for 12 months. And so the program really gets outcomes. We train our teacher aides with this as well. And of course, now we're using the decodable text and the phonemic and the phonological focus as much as possible, but we still have some parents whose schools are not doing that yet. So we work with you to support you in that way. But basically what we're saying is if you can get read little and often, like 15, 20-minute sessions 3 times a week or 4 times a week, that puts in a huge amount of repetition and overlearning. So you've got good classroom teaching practice, you've got teacher aides working with your children, and you're doing the 3 sessions at home. And when I worked across the 30 schools, we actually found that if children got 4 sessions a week, they made excellent progress. If they got 3 sessions a week, they made very good progress. 2 sessions a week, they made some progress. And after that, it was actually hit and miss. So this is why we say if you can do 3 sessions a week, you'll actually make very good progress with your children. Now, there will be opportunities that you can do more in-depth work around home reading, but I think initially if you take the book that comes home with your child and you use this process, you will find it really helpful. Now, what we actually do is that we also want to introduce the book. So when we introduce a book, as teachers, we know that children need to have good oral language, and they also need the language experience. They need good vocabulary. A lot of our children are poor readers if they have narrow vocabulary, and they then have poor comprehension. So when we introduce a book, we actually say, looking at the picture, what do you think this book might be about? And you might pick out aspects of the book. Let's say there's a picture of a boy fishing on there. So you might talk about fishing experiences. You might go into trout fishing, deep sea fishing, any experiences and vocabulary that you talk about. You'll also introduce difficult words, things that you think that the child may have difficulty with. You can introduce them and talk about them. We also tell the children names as well, because the names of people often don't follow like letter pattern sort of knowledge. So, discussing the names before you start. Then you go on to reading the text. The child reads to you and you focus on those strategies. And then the last part of it is you ask some questions about what they've read. Now, there are two types of questions. We call them lower level thinking questions and higher level thinking questions. Our lower level thinking questions are based on what, where, when, and who. And our higher level thinking questions are the why and how questions. Sorry, what, where, when, yes. And the why and how make children think a little bit more deeply about the text and, have to go back to the text and think about the information and piece pieces of information together. So what we suggest is if your children are younger, you do the what, where, when, and who, because they can go straight back to the text and get that information. And for older students, ask why and how questions as well. So you've got the clear three parts: the book introduction, the reading part with the strategies, and the questions. And with the pause, prompt, praise idea, we actually talk about pause. We wait for 5 seconds when a child has a difficulty and we see if they use a strategy. Then we would encourage them to use the letter sound knowledge and the letter patterns to see if they could work it out. Wait another 5 seconds. If they haven't answered it, then maybe you could give one of the other prompts. But if they don't get it after 2 sessions, just tell them. We don't want them to think that reading's too difficult and they actually get frustrated. But we generally find that most children will get the word with the one prompt, and occasionally they will actually need 2. And the last one is actually praise. And with the praise aspect, we actually want to, excuse me, I really like the way that you read on and went back. You got that word because you worked it out. I like the way that you looked at how that word sounded and at the beginning, and you sounded out those letters, or you looked at that letter pattern and you got that because of that. Well done. So you're actually saying what they did well to get a good outcome. Try not to say, no, that's wrong. Instead, I often say, did that sound right to you? Let's go back and have another look. We really want the children to feel empowered and that they've got the strategies and that they can be positive about their reading. So the next part I want to talk about is with spelling, and often our children come home with spelling lists. And what we do is with the structured literacy program, we actually talk about spelling as in patterns. Now, I work with this book here, and Alpha to Omega. It is a structured literacy program. It teaches the developmental letter patterns. And basically, children learn letter patterns. To start with, they'll learn short vowels, long vowels, blends, digraphs, triple blends, and so on. And we teach step by step. Now, older children sometimes have missed out the learning of certain letter patterns. And so for those children, we need to go back and pick up the stages that they have missed. Now, there is a great tool with letter tiles that we use to teach them. Now, I always do a screening assessment to find out which letter patterns are known and which are yet to be learned. But school may also have this information, and they may send home a word list that's connected to the letter pattern that they're learning. So we will look at the make and break section, and I will talk about that shortly. As parents, we're often called upon to help with both reading and home spelling, and often schools will send home word lists for us to work with. Now, for some of you that are working with schools that are doing structured literacy, you may find that your word lists are actually coming home out in certain letter patterns. Others of you may just have random words. Now, one of the things that I have found that the best way of supporting our children is with a program called Alpha to Omega. Alpha to Omega is a structured literacy program, and it teaches the developmental stages of spelling. So children will, when they're new to school, they will start by learning all their letter sounds and letter names, and then they will move to short vowels, learning their long vowels, learning blends, then digraphs where two letters go together and so on. And progressively they have these steps. Now, the great thing about the Alpha to Omega program is that it actually has developmental stages of learning. It actually does repetition and overlearning. It teaches in a multi-sensory way, that hear it, see it, and do it. And we've had outstanding results with the program. We find many children improve 18 months to 2 years in spelling by working in this way. It's also an integrated reading, writing, and spelling program. And the research is showing that when you do reading, writing, and spelling together, you also get the best results. Now, one of the great things that I find about this program, there's actually 3 stages in it. So stage 1 is for children up to 8 years, stage 2 is for children up to 12 years, and stage 3 is for children up to 15 years. So you can have great, like good spellers, or some of your older children can work at different levels. Now, with each age group, we do an assessment. We find out which letter patterns children know, and then we move them systematically through the stages. So this is an amazing way of making sure that the foundations are in place and then actually building on those. So if I'm going to actually show you now how to make spelling fun using various different resources. And I will also share with you some of the resources that are available on our website that you can get, or that you can actually make and use for yourself. So we'll talk about a range of different things. Now, I'll just bring that up here so that you can see. Now, there are also on the website, there are some books that will be helpful. Particularly the one I would recommend is the Wobbly Kids Guide for Parents, Growing Great Children with Diversity and Learning Differences. The Alpha to Omega book is there, but I don't recommend that as parents you get the book. That's for teachers. But what we're going to be using today is we're going to be using these letter tiles as a fun way of teaching spelling. Now, you can either get written tiles or you can get unwritten ones and make them, like write them yourself. And we're also going to play the dice game, and you can get unwritten and written dice game. So you may want to make your own. You can also use other things, like if you've got junior Scrabble tiles, junior Scrabble, those are a great one to use for spelling because they also use lowercase letters. Also, if you've got games at home like Upwards, Bananagrams, Boggle, and things like that, they're also useful to add to the program. Up here, you will actually see we've got a Soundplay CD, and that's actually got 64 different games on it that you can download and print, and that can reinforce your spelling. And I'm also going to show you today the Weird Word game. Where's it gone? Here it is here. And that's a really good one for helping with, we talked about auditory processing problems and visual processing problems. So that's a really good one for that as well. So at least you know that those things are there if you want to get some resources. So we'll go back to the PowerPoint shortly, but I wanted to talk to you about how to use the letter tiles, how to play the dice game, and also how to do the Weird Word game. So I'll leave it on this so that you can see what I'm doing. And so we're going to start off with letter tiles. Now, whenever children come home with spelling words, if they have them as letter patterns, so let's say, for example, they've got the AR, OR, or ER pattern, we might get them to write down some words like jar, far, tar, bar, and there are actually some word lists that you can that go with each of the letter patterns. So you would start by writing down those letter patterns. The next step is that you do this make and break with letter tiles. And I've got some letter tiles here, and you'll see that the consonants are done in one colour and the vowels are actually done in red. And the reason that we do the vowels in red is so that students can easily identify them. Now, let's say you have a young child and that child is still learning their short vowel sound. And I'm just going to do a little exercise so that you can see how we use the tiles. Now, for example, I might make, and if I've got parents on here, I usually give them some letter tiles that they can work with or print and do this with us. But let's say, for example, that we were going to make the word bag. She had a handbag. Now, I always give the children a sentence so they can get the content, text of the spelling, and they can actually hear what we're saying. And so that's not too difficult to make the word bag. Now, then I say, could you please change the word bag to beg? The dog will beg for food. And I ask, what do you have to do to change bag to beg? Now, most people will say you change the vowel. Some people will say you change the A to the E. And I say, yes, that's right. We change the A to the F. So we immediately transfer from using the name of the letter to using the sound of the letter, because children actually have to understand the letter sound. So then I say, could you change beg to big? And they identify that they have to change the F to the I. And actually, it's really interesting because depending on what culture you come from, all your letter sounds are different. And it's really important that whatever language that you're learning in, that you know the letter sounds for that language. Now, I find, for example, that many children get mixed up between the Māori vowel sounds R, E, or U, and the English vowel sounds A, E, O, and A. And I find even high school students have been taught the Māori vowels much better than they've been taught the English vowels, so they continue to have problems both in reading and in spelling because of that. So it's very important that we teach all the letter sounds. And I say to children that you have to have those in your back pocket. And anything you've got in your pocket, you can pull it out whenever you want it. So it's important to know that. So then we might say we've changed beg to big. Could you change big to bog? And could we change bog to bug? And I usually make up a silly sentence like there was a muddy bog, and then there are lots of bugs in the bog. So that gives them those ideas. Now, if you've got some little people, you can then say, could you change bug to hug? Could you change hug to hut? So you're changing the first sounds, you're changing the last sounds, and you're getting them very familiar with short vowels and also the sounds of all the consonants. And you would continue doing that with little people until they've mastered it. Now, if I had little new children, I would just do the A sound to start with. Then we'd move on to the F, the I, the O, and the A. If you've got older children and you're just revising them, you might do 2 vowel sounds at a time. If you've got year 4 or 5 children, you might just be doing a revision of all the vowel sounds. So depending on the age of your child, you slow it down. Now, I want you may have a year 2 or 3 child, and those children often have trouble between the R, the O, and the sounds. And so I would say to these children, could you please make the word far? He went far away. And because we've already done the dictation words, they know about the R, the O, and the sound, so they're just making them. And then I would say, he went far away to the farm. And so they're adding the M sound there. And going far away to the farm won't do him any harm. And then I would ask, what's the pattern in all of those words? And they would say, R. Then I would say, could you please make the word for? He went for a walk. And again, because we've already done the dictation words, they know that we're making an OR sound, not the OUR. So they go for a walk. We go to school, and it's not very long before we're asked to fill out a form. And again, putting that N sound on, and filling out a form is often the norm. And so again, those beginning sounds and end sounds. And the pattern in all of those words is or. Then we will actually move to the her sound, sound, I should say. And can you make her? Can you help her? And let's turn her into a herd of cows. And we've been spending far too long on the computer, and we've all turned into nerds. Can you make nerd, please? And then we're going to be very clever, and we're going to change the short sound and, the first sound and the last sound, and we're going to change nerd to fern. And the pattern in all of those words is And so you can see how very quickly we've shown them or, and and they can hear the difference between those sounds. Now, the great thing about what we're doing here is that children are hearing it, they're seeing it, and they're doing it. And as we know from the 7 excellence words we talked about, that is just so important to help children with their learning. They're also getting the visual if they've got visual weaknesses, and they're also getting the auditory if they've got auditory weaknesses. And it's fun. You know, the children aren't doing much writing. Now, just in case you think this is just for little people, you might have some year 5 or 6s or even some year 7 and 8s. And how many of the children have trouble with the shin pattern, T-I-O-N? When is it T-I-O-N? When is it S-I-O-N? When is it S-S-I-O-N? And when is it S-H-U-N? And sometimes you get all interesting, children spell it differently from that as well. So I get everyone to make the shin word, T-I-O-N. And then I say, let's get this in motion. So we've made shin, and then they add motion. And then I say, I met the wicked witch, and she was busy concocting a potion. She told me to rub it on like a lotion. And you can see that we're just changing these words. And you could go, there's no right or wrong. Any shin word would do. You can talk about option. You can talk about elocution. But I get people to make the word locomotion. Now, because we've made the shin part, we've put motion. Now all we've got to do is actually add the loco to it. So locomotion. Now, somebody said to me that we should teach children with learning difficulties to read and spell in syllables. I thought that's a really good idea. Then they said there are actually 11 rules for teaching syllables. And I thought, you are not going to teach a child with learning difficulties 11 rules. Now, somebody else said, oh, you don't have to bother with rules. You can do this. Locomotion. Every time you drop your chin, it's a syllable. And then somebody else said, oh, you don't have to worry about that. We clap syllables. Locomotion. Clapping syllables is fine if you're a good auditory learner, but if you're not a good auditory learner, that's difficult. So doing it this way is really helpful. Now, I remember working with a year 8 boy, and I'd had him for over a year. He was diagnosed with dyslexia early. He had a lot of extra programs, a lot of tuition. And I went to a Neil Mackay workshop in Auckland. And Neil Mackay is the British dyslexia specialist. And he introduced this, what he calls make and break, using letter tiles. And I came back and I adapted the make and the break to working with Alpha to Omega and teaching children to read and spell with letter tiles. Now, this boy suddenly took off, and he improved 18 months very quickly with both his reading and his spelling. And from then on, I actually started using Alpha to Omega with all my students, along with the tutor reading program that focused on letter sounds and letter patterns. And the students, without exception, started improving very quickly. So I've since then been teaching this system to parents, and most parents either end up getting or making a set of letter tiles to actually have at home so they can do their spelling this way. So to start with, as I mentioned, you do sort of some dictation words using the child's list or their letter pattern. You then do the make and break. Now, there is also a dice game. And with the dice game, there are, just like wooden dice with letters on, there is a stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3 dice set. And each dice set contains the letter pattern for that stage. Now, you only use the dice that you've taught. So, for example, if your child has only done short vowels and consonants, you would just use the dice with short vowels and with vowels and consonants on. Now, you get the children to roll the dice, all of them, and they have to make words. They get 1 point for every word they make, and they get 2 points for the letter pattern of the day. So, for example, if they had just done the AR, OR, ER pattern of the day, you'd use all the dice up to that stage, you'd roll them, and then the children can have up to 5 minutes to make as many words as they can. They find it really fun. They write down the words that they've made. So they're reading them, they're making them, and they're writing them. Now, doing the dice game, you're practicing the letter pattern of the day, and you're also practicing all the previous letter patterns that were taught. Now, we thought that children might get bored with these letter tiles and dice games, but we found even 2 years after doing tutoring with students, if we didn't bring the letter tiles and the dice game to the tutoring sessions, the students were asking, where are they? They never seemed to get bored because we were always working with different letter patterns, and so the game was always interesting and challenging. So after the letter tiles, you do the dice game, and then many parents actually also get the weird word game. Now, the weird word game comes with a little booklet which actually tells you how to do it. There are also 6 levels in the word game. So whatever stage your children are at, you can play at that level. So, for example, if they were only on the CBC words, you would do CBC. Like, I shouldn't say CBC like that because you'll think, what does that mean? Consonant, vowel, consonant, which is 3-letter words. And for short, we call them CBC. And I get children to read and spell non-words. And what I mean by non-words is they actually have to, they're kind of made up. And the reason for that is a lot of children learn words off by heart. And if they learn words off by heart, you actually don't know whether they're sight words or whether they're actually reading. So, for example, if I put up an M with this, they would read that, and that would be MIP. And they can't guess that because MIP actually isn't a word. And I might do here, no, what can I think of that isn't a word? Let's see, a CAG. Okay, so if I put a C up there with that, they would have to read it as CAG. Now, all of these are color-coded, and you can do different letter patterns, and they can be quite challenging. So, for example, if I put these ones up here, and I said I got someone to read this, this would say slock. Okay, so it's like sock, but it's actually slock. This one here, blick. Okay, so they've got to know their blend and their ick pattern in order to be able to read that. Now, then you get them to spell. So if I got them to spell the word zinc, how would you spell zinc? And again, because it isn't a word, they have to really focus on using their ears and understanding those letter sounds. And so this is why we say this program is really helping to develop their auditory skills, So those children who've got auditory discrimination, it's great for, and also for children to develop their visual skills. And a lot of good spellers actually have a memory bank for the words. And when you ask them to spell a difficult word, they often look up. And when you start seeing your children looking up to find the words, you know that they're starting to develop their visual memory for words. So this is actually a really useful tool as well. Now, the last part of our spelling program is that we actually do 3 sentences of dictation, and we just make up dictation sentences using the letter pattern that we've taught for that day. Now, the great thing about doing dictation, and I would always do this at the end of a session, is that they're starting to transfer their spelling learning straight into their writing. Often we find we can give children a list of 10 words or 20 words in a week. They get them right on the test on Friday, but then later on, next week, you notice that they've got those same words wrong in their writing. So by transferring and doing 3 sentences of dictation, they can get their writing sorted. So I'll just bring up the PowerPoint again. And you should be able to see that now. And so we've actually covered quite well today around we want to make the spelling program fun. So we're going to dictate some words or use their letter list that's actually come home. And we're going to use letter tiles to make and break. We're going to play the dice game. We're going to use the weird word game if we've got it. And you can also use any other games that you've got at that point, like Junior Scrabble. I use a game called Quiddler, which there's a Junior Quiddler, which is a kind of like, it's a card game, but it's like Scrabble, and you're making the words with cards. We talked about upwards, we talked about bananagrams, you might have boggle, any of those things that you can use, and then you finish with the 3 sentences. And many parents actually say doing both their reading and their spelling this way, kids actually look forward to their home learning sessions. And what's so important is that you are doing the repetition and overlearning that children need. So if you can do 3 sessions at least of reading a week and 3 spelling sessions a week, that will be very help to accelerate the learning of your children, and it will add to what's happening at school or what they're doing with their teacher aides. So there we are. We've actually covered the reading and the spelling. Now, for those of you that want more, there are additional courses that you can do that can cover more information, and it may be that your school is also doing or offering parents sessions with us as well. So you can either email me or you can ask at school about that. And we've got one more session I would like to go on to before we finish. Many parents actually wonder whether their child has a learning difficulty, and they may be thinking about getting their children assessed. Now, what we're going to talk about now, there are 32 characteristics of children with learning differences, and this can be a really good way of determining whether your child has a learning difficulty or not. So we're going to go through these briefly, and you can actually add up the number of characteristics that you see in your child or in your children to help determine that. Now, we're looking for 6 to 10 characteristics or more. If a child had 6 to 10 characteristics, they would have quite a mild learning difference, but many children with learning difficulties have many of these. So often these are children who are intelligent, but then you actually notice they don't always perform to how clever they are. And you think, how come they can do this, but they can't do that? That's one characteristic of a learning difficulty. It's also that children who have trouble following instructions. And you might also find that they seem to have selective hearing. They can hear some things, but not others. Now, at this point, people often say to me, isn't this all children? Whilst yes, sometimes if you try to talk to your children while they're watching TV, for example, they may not hear or respond to you. But what we say is that children with learning difficulties do these things longer, louder, and more often. And so this actually stands out, particularly in a classroom. You can see children who have problems following instructions and only hearing things selectively. The child who never has what they need at the right time. Does your child forget everything for school? Sometimes forget their lunch, forget their reading books, forget their togs, don't bring the note home, don't have what they need for a particular thing that's happening. The child whose room and desk are always in a mess, and they always have a bit of a disheveled looking appearance. They've often got their clothes on back to front, got dirty knees, haven't got their hair brushed in the morning. You look at their school bag and it's always got half-eaten lunches in there and squash food on notes and things like that. Or their desk is a mess or their room is a mess. One characteristic. The clumsy child who trips over their own feet. Now, interesting, we would have thought of being clumsy as just like a personality characteristic, but we now recognize when we understand underpinning weaknesses that this can be either a gross and fine motor skill difficulty, and it can also be a hand-eye coordination problem. So it's a sign of those underpinnings. Now, all of our children with learning difficulties, there's a social, emotional, and behavioural component, and often our children don't pick up sort of the rules of socialising. They often find friendship things that we would take for granted, and they have difficulties, and they have difficulty keeping friends because of that. Sometimes these children get the sequence of letters wrong. They also get confused by the order of numbers, and we now know that that's a visual or an auditory sequencing difficulty that we talked about. Children who can't keep their hands to themselves and are always touching others. Now, we would have thought that this was a behaviour problem, but often that's actually a characteristic of a learning difficulty. The child who carries on a joke long after it's finished. You might be sitting at the dinner table, everybody has a joke and it's funny, and someone has to carry it on, a sign of a learning difficulty. They don't understand when something is finished with and we're moving on. Children who get confused between breakfast, lunch and dinner. They mix up yesterday, today and tomorrow, and their timing is off. There is always a language of time. Often they have trouble telling the time on analog clocks and digital clocks. They often have difficulty with ideas like the one before and the one after in maths. So that's a characteristic. Sometimes our children get really frustrated, and they can go from 0 to 100 in terms of anger when something upsets them in a split second. Often children on the spectrum can get frustrated, and also children with ADHD. And we often think, I have parents say to me, and teachers actually, oh, they just lost it over nothing. But if you can talk to the child, there is usually several things that happen that led up to it. It looks like it's nothing, but it was actually the straw that broke the camel's back. So that's one characteristic. They're often afraid to try new things, and they're frightened by changes in routine. And we talked about that with teacher aides being away, with teachers being away. Sometimes if you go on holiday, sometimes our children don't want to go. They actually have meltdowns, and they don't like new situations. They like to be able to know what's coming next and what to expect. And so often there can be problems around new things. They'd rather be thought of as naughty than thought of as stupid. So they might behave badly so that they detract from the issue, that, you know, they don't want people to think that they're not clever. This is often the child who has difficulty with comprehension. They don't understand what they read. They can be spending so long decoding that they've got no brain capacity left for understanding what they're reading, or they can't picture things in their mind or remember what they see. So that's another characteristic. Some of the children who sit quietly but don't learn, and that's what we now recognise many of the children with inattentive type ADHD were in this situation. We have children in classes who fail quietly, and often they've never any trouble, but they just are quietly, underachieving. These children often have poor sense awareness. They hug the cat too tightly. They might grip the pencil too hard and get sore hands when they're writing. They often bruise really easily or walk into things and get bruises. And they often wear t-shirts in winter and jerseys in summer. They're often doing the wrong thing. They actually have poor sense awareness. Sometimes these children, their language will come out jumbled. They'll often stop and start in the middle of sentences, and you can hear them talking. Sometimes they trip over certain words like the hoxitals, the aminals, the eminis, and even certain words, they get the syllables out of order. That's a sign of a learning difficulty. Now, often our children, it's quite interesting. They can do complicated things, and then they can't do something that other people would find really easy. And in this sense, they can often be good with strategy and working things out, but then they don't get a riddle or a joke. And that's a bit of a, sort of an anomaly. You'd think that, if they're clever, that they would get those things. Often children get bored easily and they yawn a lot during learning. Interestingly, yawning during learning is a sign of a visual difficulty. And I often find that our children with ADHD get bored very quickly. They have a very fast brain and it moves on to other things, and they can get bored with their learning. So that's one characteristic. They often have unexpected difficulties with some motor skills. So, for example, they might be really good at playing soccer, but then trip up a lot. And that's odd. You should either be good with your feet or not so good with your feet, but you shouldn't have situations where you are and you aren't. Now, the next one is really interesting. It's called performance inconsistency. And our children seem to be able to do something one day, or they learn something and they seem to have got it. And then next week, they can't do it anymore, or they don't understand it anymore. And they can have days where they can do things and days where they can't. And this is one of the reasons why people often think our children might be lazy, unmotivated, but in actual fact, some days their neurons fire and everything works up there, and other days it doesn't. So for these children, it's not a choice. Some days they can do things and some days they can't. They're often very particular and they want things done their own way. And we often find that children on the spectrum have these characteristics. They like to have things done just how they expect them, and they often can't cope if things are changed. Some of these children tell tales on others, which often gets them into trouble. Sometimes they can be bossy. They may be a bully, and at other times they may even be the one who's bullied. And we often see them changing sort of circumstances and can be any of these things. So that's another characteristic. Interestingly, they actually play well with younger children or older children, but they have trouble keeping friends the same age. Our children are also often good with babies, but they have trouble relating to children the same age. We know that children often skip words when you're doing home reading. You might find your child skips words or they add words in. Sometimes they miss lines, and we recognise that as a scanning and tracking problem, and they may have a visual processing problem as well. So if you're noticing when you're doing home reading that that's happening, that's one example of a learning difficulty. Our children often see things as black and white, but they don't get inference. So you have to say exactly what you mean, otherwise they just don't get it. Often we talked about these children are thought of as lazy. They can be quick to do things that they like, but slow when it involves work. often when it involves work, it's hard for them, and again, those neurons don't fire, and then it's challenging for them. The child who maybe has confusing or unexpected difficulties. So maybe they can add or multiply, but then they can't subtract or divide. Sometimes they can do maths on paper, but they can't do it in their head. And that's the short-term and working memory, because they can't hold the numbers in their head. And with maths, they often get confused about the symbols, like the multiplication, division, subtraction, and so on. So that's a characteristic. Often they make social mistakes. They might be over-friendly with people, greet strangers, thinking that they're treating them like long-lost friends. They might say hello to everybody, and they often actually get set up to be the butt of jokes. And that's actually particularly challenging. They don't recognise that people are playing jokes on them. Sometimes they say things that are off topic. We notice this at school at mat time. People might put up their hand or say something that's completely off topic. You might notice it at the dinner table. But it's interesting, if you say to them, what made you say that in relation to what we're talking about, often they can tell you, and they're a few steps ahead of where we're thinking, and it sounds like they're off topic, but they're actually not really. But this is a characteristic that often, even on reports, you see that, teachers might say that they often say things off topic. Sometimes they understand really complex things, but then they have trouble that others, find easy. So that's odd. You should be able to have if you're this clever, you should be able to achieve at your age, or if you're above your age, you shouldn't have some things up here and some things down here. So that's a characteristic. And very occasionally they have a big chip on their shoulder. And they might say, I've got dyslexia, I've got ADHD, I can't do this, I can't do that. It's not common, but when they do have that, it's often around their self-esteem, that they lack confidence, and so they make excuses for the challenges that they have. And so that's a characteristic as well. So there you have the 32 characteristics. Now, I would look at a list like this and I would count how many characteristics I see for each of the children that I'm concerned about. And if you've got 6 to 10 or more, then that's a child that we would want to look at a little more closely for learning difficulties. And I find this is a very good tool for parents to start, and also for teachers. And then we can look at screening assessments and looking at the next steps for that child. So on this video, we've actually covered 4 things. We've looked at understanding our children as learners, understanding learning difficulties. We've looked at supporting our children with reading. We've looked at supporting our children with home spelling. And lastly, we've looked at identifying characteristics of children with learning difficulties. I hope you found the information on this video helpful. If you would like to email and ask some questions, feel free to do so. If you would like a copy of this PowerPoint, email also, and we will send that to you. For those families who would like more, we do offer screening assessments so that we can determine whether your child has underpinning weaknesses. We also offer specialist tutoring, and we also have some more in-depth programs that can support parents with home learning and meeting the needs of students. So if you would like to find out about any more of these things, you can go to the website www.raisingachievement.com.au and find that information. And we'll also put some, if you see this on YouTube, or you may even see it on our website anyway, so that you can have those further contact details. So I look forward to working with you sometime, and thank you for sharing this video.